thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, speakers, for coming, for obliging us by coming, making time in very busy schedules at a very busy time of year. I'm Victoria de Grazia. I'm the director of the Blinken European Institute, and this is an occasion that requires just a minute of explanation. First of all, I invited this, you all to this, and planned it, thinking it's our intellectual obligation to discuss something which seems so significant for the U.S. foreign policy, for Syria, for all the notions of global justice and human rights, which are so much in debate. And so in that sense, as an engaged intellectual, we don't have any more, unfortunately, the kind of teaching events that we used to have, but this in some sense is a surrogate. It's also part of the Blinken European Institute's mandate by which it was founded, endowed, to address questions that have to do with public diplomacy, and we've been trying, in terms of our mandate, which does require us also to think very much about Europe, to consider problems of soft power, hard power, the interface between them, the questions of human rights, the new diplomacy. And so this, in some sense, is the first event of this year, obligatory insofar as there are force majeure, which would demand it also on other grounds. And we will be having other occasions. We'll have returning ambassadors from Europe, a mix of public diplomacy and critiques of public diplomacy as it's practiced in the United States, but also globally over the course of the year. We'll let you know about those. Hey, so today, let me introduce our panel. First of all, I'd like to introduce Stuart Gottlieb, who's an adjunct professor of international affairs and public policy at SIPA. He teaches courses on American foreign policy, counterterrorism, and international security, and he got his PhD here from Columbia in international relations. He's worked in, shall we say, the public sector in the United States Senate as a policy advisor, also to Senator Schumer of New York, and also to Christopher Dodd of Connecticut. Second edition of his book, Debating Terrorism, Counterterrorism, Conflicting Perspectives on Causes, Contexts, and Responses, was published very recently, April 2013. And he's working now on a book titled Experimental Power, The Rise and Role of America in World Affairs, which we're very much looking forward to in terms of our purposes. I'd like then to introduce next Jean Cohen, who's got her PhD from New School for Social Research. This is before we need to talk about this. She's presently professor, the Nell and Herbert Singer Professor of Political Thought at Columbia. Many of you know her for her work on critical theory, on civil society, human rights, and gender. Recently, we've celebrated her book here, criticized it, applauded it, on globalization and sovereignty, rethinking legality and legitimacy and constitutionalism. Okay, and she's now working with the Blinken Institute on her volume, Political Religion, Legal Pluralism, and Democratic Citizenship, which will come out with Columbia University in 2014. Etienne Balibar is a professor emeritus of moral and political philosophy at the University of Paris, Etienne, at Nanterre, and he's been distinguished professor of humanities at the University of California at Irvine. We are very grateful to have him come repeatedly to Columbia, where he's a visiting professor in the Department of French and Romance Philology. He's published very widely in the area of Marxist philosophy and more generally moral and political philosophy, and his latest works include Réflexions sur la médiation européenne and Europe, Constitution and Frontier, 2005. Very pleased to have him. And Jean-Marie Guéhenno doesn't seem to be here yet, so we hope he will be coming, and I will introduce him at that moment. And Jack Snyder, who's also received his PhD from Columbia, but that is not the important thing. That he's Robert René Belfer Professor of International Relations. He's an expert on international relations and on Soviet and post-Soviet area. And he's written widely on crisis diplomacy, democratization, and very, very pleased that he is able to be here. And I will now wait for 1 second until Professor Guéhenno, thank you so much, Director for the Center for International Conflict Resolution and CEPA. I know this is an end of class moment, so we're all a bit breathing hard having gotten here. And presently the Associate Director for the Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's published widely on the impact of globalization on strategy, on globalization in the international system. I'm very, very grateful for you to be here. What we're going to be doing is starting a sort of accumulation, and we're going to be starting with Stuart. Everybody will be speaking about 7 minutes, and then we will continue in the way of discussion and debate. Unfortunately, I have to leave at 5:20, which put Chris Hill, who's the Associate Director of the Blinken European Institute, will step in to mediate, which will surely be a very lively discussion and debate.
Thanks,
Stuart,
appreciate it. I'm going to begin by reading from the account of an observer of the poison gas attacks, of which we're now all too familiar in some cases. Quote, special discharge devices were built into the rockets so they could vaporize over vast territory a fine death-dealing gas. Groups of rockets followed one another so that the fog issued from them formed a continuous sheet as men, women, and children were drenched with this deadly poison. The very refinement of barbarism consisted in carrying ravage and terror into the most densely populated part of the country. The object was to scatter fear and death. These fearful tactics succeeded. The deadly gas made all those whom it touched shriek in pain, and thousands to die in the most dreadful suffering, unquote. These were not words from an observer on the ground in Syria in August. This is from only a slightly edited version of Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, in his June 30th, 1936 address to the League of Nations in Geneva, when he described the, quote, criminal, unquote, the, quote, criminal use, unquote, of poison gas by Mussolini's invading Italian army, and when he passionately begged the world to come to the assistance of Ethiopia. Now, I should note that both Italy and Ethiopia were parties to the League of Nations Treaty. I should also note that both Italy and Ethiopia were parties to the 1925 Geneva Protocols banning the use of chemical weapons in warfare. And Selassie concluded his address by decrying the famous global inaction in the face of the slaughter in Ethiopia. That the nations of the world community turning their collective backs, ignoring their supposed international obligations to act under the League of Nations Treaty and Geneva Protocols. Haile Selassie concluded his address with a series of pointed questions, which I will only slightly paraphrase as, if not now, when? And if not here, where? And he concluded by saying, if not on behalf of Ethiopia, do you not realize it might soon be you? Was how he ended this. Now, much has changed in the world since 1936, and the debating society of the League of Nations has been replaced by a much more realistic and therefore a much more effective global peace and security organization known as the United Nations, more specifically the UN Security Council. And a case can be made that over the past several decades there's been an evolution in norms and principles now embodied in international law that help guide and shape state behavior more in the direction of respect for human rights and humanitarian principles, and to potentially compel states to act internationally on behalf of those principles. But as the Syria case explicitly shows, issues surrounding military intervention on moral grounds are enormously complex. And there are no easy answers regarding what direction the world is currently going with respect to establishing universal norms and standard practices of behavior when it comes to humanitarian intervention, particularly military intervention into sovereign states confronting rebellion and civil war. There are two competing and sometimes complementary forces here. One are straight global humanitarian norms, such as prohibition on genocide, that when violated may call for outside intervention. And secondly, there are hybrid global humanitarian and security norms, such as prohibition on use of chemical weapons, that aside from the clear humanitarian component, are also of broader security concern for major powers because of the harmful precedent that weapons of mass destruction use would set for their possible future and further use. The use of chemical weapons in particular, though not as deadly as other WMD like biological or radiological or nuclear, can be seen in, if you want to think of it this way, as a gateway drug potentially to bigger and worse WMD. So it's a core global security concern as well as being a humanitarian concern. So sort of a clash of norms going on here, humanitarian norms versus security norms. This tension defines the case of Syria. Let's not forget that there was no talk of direct military intervention into Syria, even after 100,000 civilians were killed over 2 years in a bloody rebellion and a brutal government counter-rebellion. Talk of direct military intervention only came into play with the question of use of chemical weapons as the two norms merged. The norm of humanitarian intervention itself and norms regarding the spread and use of WMD generally. The Obama administration's often confused, and I would almost call it a spaghetti on the wall approach to Syria, is evidence of this. On the one hand, Secretary of State John Kerry has mostly spoken of the, quote, moral obscenity, unquote, of chemical weapons used by the Assad regime, implying that U.S. military strikes were justified on moral grounds alone, while Obama has mostly spoken about what he refers to as the, quote, global norm, unquote, against the use of WMD in war, implying that military strikes were justified not just on the moral case, but also on the strategic case. If this isn't confusing enough, there's another complicating factor that hovers over the entire question of not just moral intervention in Syria, but of moral intervention in general. And that's the 2011 Libya intervention, which was sold on the grounds of a purely humanitarian intervention, the so-called responsibility to protect, or the R2P principle, but quickly became a regime change operation. And that enterprise threw a monkey wrench into all of these big questions. Syria can only be understood in the context of and under the long shadow of the extremely problematic Libya intervention, which I hope we have a little time to get into because I might not be able to get into it as much as I'd like in this opening. Before I will briefly get us from Libya to Syria, but let me just at least touch on the context here very, very briefly. People in the room know this. The context of the current humanitarian intervention questions and the difficulties of them starts with the United Nations system, which was created in 1945, but the UN system has built-in contradictions that are really important for this discussion. On the one hand, the UN Charter upholds the Westphalian model of primacy of state sovereignty, and Articles 2.4 and Articles 2.7, for example, protect and defend the state's right. Only the state government has the right to intervene on behalf of peace and security in its own borders. So the Westphalian system is alive and well in the UN Charter, with the assumptions that states are the sole legitimate guarantors, like I said, of peace and security in their own borders. And I don't want to bury the lead here. 2 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, China and Russia, view this as the cornerstone of the legitimacy of the organization itself. But there are contradictions, as we know, competing clauses such as Article 55, which talks about respect for principle of equal rights and self-determination and human rights, and Article 56, which talks about all members have an obligation to act on behalf of human rights and other what we think of as enlightened principles. In recent years, especially since the 90s, since the civil wars in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, there's been a major effort at consensus building regarding humanitarian intervention based on Articles 55 and 56, which has led to evolution of the so-called R2P principle. Now, not everyone agrees with this evolution. Realists and even some supporters of humanitarian intervention say that moving too far too fast with these principles can actually undercut the possibility of long-term success of these supposedly evolving principles of humanitarian intervention. So these are very complicated issues. I'm going to simplify just a couple more things briefly, because we have to remember that the ultimate decisions regarding whether or not military intervention on moral grounds will take place, these decisions are going to come from states making these decisions in their capitals. States are the entities that will ultimately expend the treasure and possibly blood, and in the case of democracies, possibly against popular opinion at home and at great political risk, as we recently have seen in the British Parliament and the US Congress. And to narrow it down even further, there are only a relatively small number of states in the world who have the capacity to project the kind of military power on a global scale that might be needed in a military intervention for humanitarian purposes. Let's narrow it down even further than that. It's really the P5 countries on the UN Security Council that are the top 5 military powers in the world and also have a veto capacity in that organization. And the United States, as one of the P5 members, has more military capacity than all of the rest combined. So these are the actors that will ultimately be the most important in making this decision, which is what separates the United Nations from the League of Nations system, where you have power that plays a role on the UN Security Council, but it also could potentially lead to a tremendous amount of stalemate when those great powers disagree. So then the question is, if the great powers disagree on a course of action, what do you do? Are you stuck like a deer in the headlights as 120,000 people die? If China and Russia don't say that it's okay to intervene. We can get back to Libya maybe a little bit later, but the Libya intervention spooked countries like China, not just China, Russia, but also India, Brazil, Arab League countries, and other countries that saw that as initially a protecting civilians in Benghazi, quickly turned into a regime change operation. And they took the first opportunity that they could in October of 2011 to vote against a very watered down resolution, just condemning the violence in Syria in general. They voted against that to make a stand saying, we think any resolution coming out discussing internal goings-on of a sovereign country, it could potentially lead to another Syria outcome. And it's very difficult to get past Russia and China on the Security Council. And some, I'm going to just wrap it up with this point. I could bring it up a little bit later if people are interested. Some say if Russia and China don't approve, then there's nothing that can be done. And states can't take it on themselves to enforce and protect, international law. There was an op-ed a couple of weeks ago by a couple of Yale law professors, Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, that made that exact case, that if the United States did the military strikes that Obama threatened to do, that would violate international law. It would be illegitimate. And they said unless the UN Security Council authorizes it, it's illegal. Instead of military strikes, they said there's plenty that the world can do to protect the Syrian public. Let me give you an example of one of them. They said instead of bombing illegally the Syrian regime, Obama should instead work with Congress to do much more for Syrian rebels and refugees, including providing antidotes to nerve agents, which are in short supply, unquote. So instead of the United States acting to retaliate against the use of chemical weapons, they suggested something that I think would be far short of what humanitarianism was calling out to do. Now, I responded to that op-ed. I had a piece in the New York Times the next day criticizing them, saying that, if you hold the UN Security Council to that standard, it will revert back to the League of Nations system of a constant stalemate and inaction, and then we will have the unfortunate situation, which we probably already do, actually I know we already do, of Syrian rebel leaders, not the al-Nusra types, but some legitimate folks that are opposing the regime asking the same question as thousands more die by the week. If not here, where? And if not now, when?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. There will probably be some overlap, but that's good because there's also some disagreement already, I suspect.
Overlap will increase when we move to the...
That's the nature of the
Hope
beast.
we increase both.
All
as we
right.
go along.
The issue of humanitarian military intervention in a sovereign state that has apparently used banned chemical weapons against its citizenry raises, as Stuart said, complex moral, legal, and political questions. The first moral question that arises is general and abstract while also being substantive. What threshold of violations of international law, killing of civilians, crimes against humanity, and or human rights violations has to be crossed to suspend the sovereignty argument against international intervention and count as a defeasibly sufficient ground for possibly taking action against violators that would not otherwise be permissible or normatively available? There is some general agreement that what I call in a recent book of mine on globalization and sovereignty, the 4 E's, mass extermination, expulsion, ethnic cleansing, and enslavement, are not deemed to be within the domaine réservé of sovereign states today, and that the international community has a responsibility to protect, R2P, which was just mentioned, to protect individuals from such action by states in which they reside or are citizens. The use of chemical weapons, especially against the civilian population, be it in a civil war or otherwise, certainly seems to be above the threshold. Indeed, the idea of R2P denying sovereign immunity regarding such crimes was articulated in the UN 2005 outcome document unanimously endorsed by the General Assembly, mentioning 4 possible triggers for international concern and intervention: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. However, the substantive moral question of thresholds is inextricably linked to a procedural one. Who decides if or when such a threshold has been reached, and who may act, i.e. intervene militarily, to put a stop to it? The R2P document just mentioned restricted the question of right authority, the old just war concept, to make such assessments regarding threshold and the decision to use coercive means to the Security Council. This brings me to the legal questions raised by humanitarian intervention generally and the Syria case in particular. Forgive me if I remind you, and you already did that, but in another way. I deal typically of 2 stages of international law, the one dominant from the 19th century till 1945, and the one that exists today ever since the construction of the UN Charter system, along with other treaties and forms of humanitarian law. But I want to make a point in so doing. Prior to the UN Charter system, what was known perhaps misleading as the Westphalian sovereignty model ascribed sovereign states in international society the right to war, the right to self-help, immunity from outside intervention in internal affairs, impermeable domestic state power, the black box, among other prerogatives. 2 things are worth stressing. De jure, each sovereign state could decide for itself if it suffered aggression, and if any violation of international law regarding its interests had occurred, and each sovereign state was deemed the right authority, i.e. the decider, to quote someone, and the actor who rights the wrong, self-help, in this decentered international legal system. Each state could declare and engage in war if it deemed it necessary to correct any violation of its sovereignty or sovereign interests. In addition, how the sovereign state regulated its internal affairs and treated its own citizens or those under its control was not the business of outsiders. De facto, this meant that the great powers decided on war, and of course, as is well known, many of these were European imperial and or imperialist states who intervened in non-sovereign states, went to war, occupied, and sometimes annexed those defeated, and exercised imperial dominion and colonial rule. In the aftermath of 2 world wars, genocide, and so forth, the second half of the 20th century witnessed an unprecedented effort to legally regulate the use of force and install a collective security regime. While it took some decades, formal empires were disbanded, and all the new states, now I think 193, I always get that number, or 192, formed out of the debris of European empires and were ascribed sovereignty by the international system and sovereign equality with its corollaries of non-intervention, self-determination, and political autonomy became the norm. I don't think this is a Westphalian dimension of the UN Charter system, but we can debate that. However, the UN Charter system, of which most, if not all, sovereign states are members, also installed a new sovereignty regime with 3 key differences from the previous models. States no longer have the right to war, international aggression is banned, and human rights affirmed. The regime of self-help is replaced, according to the new norms, by collective security, which was mentioned, and its correlative principles of sovereign equality and non-intervention. The UN Charter allows only 2 exceptions to this rule: self-defense if a state is or is about to be attacked, and this does not include the right to preventive war that was rejected by the UN outcome document, and Chapter 7 powers ascribed to the UN Security Council to sanction aggression and use military force if necessary to maintain international peace and security. So the right authority is now firmly lodged in the Security Council. The principles of self-determination and political autonomy do not, however, entail immunity from international concern, and there have been important shifts in the conception of what should be in the domaine raisonné of any sovereign state, as the UN Summit document indicates. Humanitarian intervention per se is not black-letter international law, and that document only has the status of a General Assembly resolution. But it's indisputable that under contemporary international law or norms, it is the Security Council that decides when violations of international humanitarian law against genocide, including crimes against humanity, the illegal use of chemical weapons, or other internal aggressions against one's own citizenry, crosses the threshold and becomes a matter of international concern and possible military sanction if it gets cast as a threat to international peace and security. This is the current international legal, normative, and security system we have today. Now, some insist that this system is dysfunctional. They claim that in the face of humanitarian disasters, Chapter 7 mechanisms have remained a dead letter even after the Cold War, thanks to the veto power of the P5 on the Council, especially Russia and China. Indeed, some moral humanitarians argue that in cases of serious violations, any state able and willing to put a stop to them should. For them, Council votes against humanitarian intervention prove that the Charter mechanisms don't work and the international legal norms are moot. But this logic is flawed. Just because one loses a vote, or assumes one will lose a vote, in favor of military intervention in a particular case, for example, Syria now, doesn't mean that the system is inoperable or that there is no viable international law. It just means you lost the vote, or would lose the vote. To be sure, law requires some efficacy, and as was just indicated, as a matter of fact, the Security Council has voted for interventions post-1989 on several occasions: Iraq, Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Libya, whatever we think of all that. So obviously, losing a vote cannot be the criteria for whether Chapter 7 mechanisms work or not. To follow that logic would be doubly regressive. It would mean returning to the old and discredited sanction theory of law that confuses a legal norm with the sanction or efficacy, and it would drag us back to the pre-World War I even system, albeit in a new imperial form, although, as already indicated, the Westphalian system was imperial as well. In short, it would give the green light to powerful imperial-minded states to decide and to intervene if they so wish. Hardly an inviting prospect, since we should all know by now that there are no disinterested humanitarian heroes out there, I mean states, among the great powers. Does this mean, I'm ending sort of like you, does this mean, although differently, does this mean that I embrace legalism and think nothing can be done when there's large-scale killing of domestic populations or violations of international law and universal norms, as in the Syrian case of the use of chemical weapons? What if the killing gets past the threshold of the morally intolerable? Would I stick to legalism just because a veto by a state in the Security Council pursuing its own geopolitical goals? Here we have to be very careful to avoid both moralistic absolutism and rigid legalism. My answer is that, yes, we must think in terms of the spirit and not only the letter of the law. This means that military action contemplated by a powerful state to stop atrocities would have to satisfy at least 3 and more criteria to be legitimate. A, it would have to have very broad international support. B, domestic approval of representative bodies, if it has any. C, there would have to be a sufficient coalition of states willing, sounds familiar, I know, to engage in the action and to follow international law in the aftermath, unlike what happened in Libya. This could lend the action legitimacy in cases of urgency, even if it's illegal, and indeed it would have to be judged afterward on appropriate grounds, a kind of ex post facto jury. But, and this is crucial, political judgment also has to enter into the fray. By political judgment, I mean ethical and pragmatic / strategic calculations. Clearly, any intervention that would foreseeably make matters worse, internally or geopolitically in the neighborhood, or strengthen the hands of actors equally heinous would be unacceptable. So an ethic of responsibility must inform the decision to act rather than a moralistic ethic of conviction which disregards possible consequences. Second, we must never forget that in the domain of the political, what matters is getting the key players to the bargaining table and arriving at a political settlement for which compromise rather than absolutism must be the watchword. Interests, and not only morals or legal norms or principles, are always at play and have to be considered. The purpose of an intervention, especially in the heat of a civil war, but not only, is not to punish, but to stop and prevent further violations. So pragmatism, the intelligent use of law, has to be brought together with principle. I leave it to the IR people, one already preceded me, on the panel to discuss the geopolitics of the Syrian situation. For now, it looks like the threat of force rather than its use, especially if coupled with a Security Council resolution and international consensus on what to do next, may be our and the Syrian civilians' greatest hope.
Thank you.
My turn? Thank you very much. So, I'm not a legal theorist, I'm not a political theorist. I'm not completely sure that a philosopher has a relevant opinion in matters of political judgment. I very much agree with Jean on that. So when I was asked to take part in this panel, apart from being, of course, greatly honored and hoping to come out with clearer ideas, I had to wonder how I could intervene, and I came to the conclusion that the only thing I could do would be to express my doubts and reactions, and ultimately my pessimism as a citizen, a kind of Candide, if you like. So I tried to put this in the form of four successive points. The first of them, and you'll see I'm barely doing more than stating the obvious, but each has his way to do it, his or her. First point is, this is stating the obvious, but perhaps worth recalling. The Assad regime is a cruel dictatorship, for which we can have, or at least I think we can have absolutely no complacency. I say this because in the international discussion that is developing these days, and I receive links to articles or expressions from different parts of the world, including the Arab world, the fact that this regime has origins which can be called anti-imperialist in a broad sense, representing originally a secular, perhaps even a socialist branch of Arab nationalism, is sometimes invoked. In my view, this doesn't confer upon it any progressive or positive value, even if some of us, including myself, are suspicious of the consequences of a conquest of power by some of its adversaries, particularly the Islamist groups, which are more or less directly subsidized by the petro-monarchies of the Gulf. And so the next point is that the rebellion or the revolt, the revolution, the term is also justified, I believe, of a great, an important part of the Syrian population was entirely legitimate. And it has also to be noticed that it remained a peaceful rebellion for a very long time before an extremely brutal repression started to change the situation. But the problem is that this rebellion or revolution has now become transformed into a civil war which has no apparent solution. At the same time, because of its being invested by internal ethnic, religious divisions of the Syrian society itself, and above all, because of external interventions, including, of course, Russia and indirectly, at least, the Western powers who train troops, send money and weapons, and so on. So this is an instrumentalization of the situation that completely changed its character. It's impossible not to take into account this situation, I believe, if one begins to think about the possible consequences of new interventions in the form, in one or another form. As a consequence of this first point, I want to insist on the fact that there has already taken place an intervention from outside in Syria, which some people judge, of course, insufficient and others catastrophic. This is perhaps not foreign to the fact that in the end it seems to be leading now to something like a bargaining between the most powerful of the external parts involved, namely Russia and the United States. Second point, I have to accelerate to describe and justify in advance the strikes. Oh no, that's not possible. The strikes that are now suspended and which have been described in different words. The French and the Americans did not exactly have the same. The official motive was the use of gas, military combat, gaz de combat, which are prohibited by the international law, and the fact that Assad, I quote, gassed his own people. I'm trusting neither the American or more generally Western secret services, and of course not the arguments that the Russians oppose to that. I trust a little more the United Nations experts. But I have a tendency to think that even if this, of course, is not per se a material proof, Assad, just like his father before, was perfectly able to do that. The question is therefore to know whether the use of combat gases in a civil war forms or builds the red line or threshold for the international community to intervene. It is known that the inclusion of such weapons in the category of weapons of mass destruction is disputable and is actually disputed. What I think is that the criterion, at the same time moral and political, is the amplitude of the massacres and the destructions. And from that point of view, the possible use of this gas is part of a more general picture. It is to the massacres perpetrated by the Assad regime, and perhaps also, of course, today, some war crimes committed by part of the resistance, that we should try to find a parade of which we have to be reasonably sure that it will not produce consequences which are even worse than what they were supposed to prevent. A very difficult argument, of course, to use. It doesn't seem that the announced interventions offered that guarantee. They were rather linked to a strategic calculus, which I leave aside. The basic question and principal question is to know what one thinks of the very idea of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. My position on this point, in the dualism that Jean Cohen describes in her book, also her intervention between the abstract Westphalian and the abstract cosmopolitan point, is rather in favor of this right and duty to intervene in given circumstances of whose extreme character, of course, has to be identified. And there's a long story of cases throughout the 20th century which, in my opinion, demonstrate that. This is, of course, directed against the Schmittian kind of sovereign ideology that many, even progressists in the Arab world, that lead many of progressive people to, unfortunately, see Assad as a good guy because he's resisting in the name of national independence. But the following question is who can and who may intervene. The Western powers, and particularly the United States of America, are especially ill-placed to do that, even if, of course, Putin has no lesson to teach them, for three reasons at least. First, the long history of the American interventions in the world shows that they never had any other objectives than their own interests, or at the very least, they never left these interests aside. President Obama has admitted this even recently. Second, Americans are probably the greatest users of weapons of mass destruction or prohibited weapons. Some analysts prefer, and I like this expression, weapons of indiscriminate destruction. Gas combat for 10 years in Vietnam and others more recently. Third, in spite of fluctuations in the language from one administration to another, American interventions are linked to the idea of a mission or a special, an exceptional responsibility in the world affairs. In other terms, an imperial posture which claims to be most of the time above international law and as a consequence the United Nations as well. Of course, there's a tension here in my position, I acknowledge it. And finally, I'm sorry for the length, final point, but I think it's important. We come to the question to decide whether it's a good thing that the clever coup that has been played by the Russians to re-legitimize the Assad regime and to have the United States go back, which is perhaps, and I tend to think that what they, in fact, at least the president, were hoping to be able to do, formally at least led to bringing back the United Nations to the center of the stage. I'm not really so keen, and in any case not yet, because this has been said already. In fact, we see the United Nations caught in the permanent balance of forces between different sovereign states, which tend to make it the instrument of their own realpolitik. What this situation once again puts in full clarity is the urgent necessity to transform the United Nations themselves, trying to go beyond the control exercised by the consortium of powerful nations that arose from the Second World War, not only to reflect a different international reality, which has been said very often, but to actually enter the era of a collective control of armaments and conflicts. We all know that this is absolutely not likely to take place rapidly. Not even Russia and the United States are signatories of the treaties on the International Criminal Court, which in this case would be particularly indicated to say something and do something. So in the meantime, the Syrians will continue to die, and at the very least, it's a reason to publicly ask these questions each time we can.
Stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice. Thank you.
Okay. Can military intervention be justified in the case of Syria? For me, military intervention can be justified if it meets two tests. At least it should not undermine international law, and if possible, it should consolidate it, the first test. And the second, it should make the situation better for the people. And in my view, military intervention in Syria would fail both tests. The first test, international norms. Of course, if you have a little historical memory, you remember the first UN investigation on chemical weapons in the region. That was in 1984, when Pérez de Cuéllar sent a team to Iraq after repeated use of chemical weapons by Iraq against Iran. And that was before the use of chemical weapons in Halabja against the Kurds. And at the time, the conclusion of the investigation was that the European countries that were providing precursors to Iraq stopped their deliveries. And that was the end of the story. There was of course, no talk of intervention. If you're Iranian, you would draw the conclusion that if there is an issue of chemical weapons with a country that is against Iran, it's not so serious. If it is a country that is allied with Iran, it's a capital case. This is not a fundamental argument, but it's a historical context that matters when one discusses the consolidation of norms, because norms, they're also in the perception of the beholder, and the perception is shaped by history, by other factors too, but by history among many factors. Norms, as Jean Cohen said, in this case we have a conflict of several norms. We have a norm that has been more or less consolidated since the end of World War II, which is Article 51 of the UN Charter, that the use of force is in self-defense or under the authority of the Security Council. This norm has been violated, as has the norm concerning chemical weapons. It has not been violated too often, or at least too blatantly, by the P5. And in this particular case, there is not even a multinational organization like the NATO in the case of Kosovo. There's not even a negotiation that developed a set of norms on what needed to happen. There's nothing like that. They're just essentially three countries that believe that there is a sufficient basis to intervene, and that is it. So it's I'm not taking a position at this stage, but certainly quite a leap to decide that the norm of the prohibition of chemical weapons is so important that the other norm of how one uses force can be dismissed in such a cavalier way. It's quite by P5, by members of the P5 group, which are supposed to have a particular responsibility in upholding the norms of the UN Charter. It's serious, and the norm on the emerging norm of the responsibility to protect, it is an emerging norm. It is a norm that is qualified. In the document that comes closest to a legal document, which has no legal authority, the outcome document of 2005, it is specifically mentioned that it is under the authority of the Security Council that collective action would be taken. So that consensus of the summit of 2005 is no basis for action. Absolutely not. It goes way beyond what was agreed in 2005, which is not a resolution of the Security Council, just an outcome document. So, and last, that's a circumstantial argument. It's quite striking that the chemical weapons became an issue when several hundred people were killed. It was not raised as a big. I mean, it was raised by France, which on that point was more coherent, consistent than the U.S. But it was not raised by the U.S. as a big issue. Before there were several hundred people. And so that weakens the case because it confuses the issue of chemical weapons and the issue of the mass killings in Syria. And if it's the issue of mass killings, obviously conventional weapons have killed many more people in very horrible ways and have seen it than chemical weapons have. Chemical weapons may have killed maybe 1% compared to the other weapons. And so that raises the question of the multiplicity of motives for intervening in Syria. And that multiplicity of motives, like in alternative pleading, weakens the case rather than strengthen it. And it brings me to the second point, which is, will intervention make things better? And I think that test is hard to pass. We saw in the embarrassed discussions in testimonies in Congress that on the one hand, because there would not be political support for that, overwhelming force is not at all considered to effect regime change in a decisive way. And I'm not advocating for that, by the way, but it's certainly not considered. So there is the idea of sort of calibrating force so that it sends a message, but in the logic of deterrence, if you're not prepared to escalate, you're not credible. And so if you send a military message, and if unfortunately that message isn't followed, is not abided by, and is not heard, then you're bound to escalate, or otherwise you really you have lost everything. And so if it is about stopping chemical weapons use, the limited intervention is far from a credible means. If it is about ending the conflict, one has to be clear. Is it about creating a military stalemate? That requires a kind of fine-tuning of force. And most military would tell you that war is not something that you fine-tune. And that the reality is that use of force will harden the positions of the parties, give hope to the opposition that indeed there is a military solution. It will not precipitate a negotiation. It will lead to further military support on the other side, so it will lead to a protracted conflict, not to an accelerated negotiation. Now, let's imagine for 1 second that there was the support for a massive intervention a la Iraq, and indeed it's possible to bring down Assad. It could be done in a matter of weeks, I'm sure. There's no question about that. Now, would the result be a good result? It is not at all clear. You see now in Syria more and more IDPs in the government-controlled areas. The Sunnis who come to the government-controlled areas, they don't like the government. That government is an abominable government. It's one of the worst governments on earth. But it is, compared to the insecurity of the rebel-held areas, it's the least of two evils. And they vote with their feet now. And if there was, in that hypothetical, which is not going to happen, because there's not going to be a massive intervention, in that hypothetical case, if there was such an intervention, the reality is that it would probably lead to a second wave of war between the various components of the opposition, unless one was prepared to establish really a protectorate with massive occupation, which would lead to other problems. So in the end, I believe that actually what has happened, what we have stumbled into, thanks to the cleverness of Lavrov, who may have had the idea of a diversion in mind. We don't know. It's too early to tell. But it is actually not the worst scenario by far. It does hold the possibility of some progress on chemical weapons, because the Russians are always careful not to lose credibility. And so if they've gone out on a limb on that issue, it's probably that they have some understanding with the Syrians that the Syrians are going to be serious with chemical weapons and that some progress can be made. Of course, that progress can only be limited unless there is something broader, because it's hard to see how you can have effective chemical disarmament in the midst of a shooting war. So that needs to lead to a broader agreement, in my view, not between the Syrian government and the opposition, because I don't think any negotiation is practical at this stage between those parties, but rather within the Security Council on shaping what an outcome would be. It may not happen because some regional countries may want to derail such an outcome, but that's, in my view, a much better prospect for the people of Syria than a military intervention.
Thank you.
I thought I would say a little bit about the argument that you commonly hear these days, that if the U.S. fails to prevail on the Syrian chemical weapons issue, that it will have serious reputational costs for the U.S., for Obama, and for international normative regimes, at least about chemical weapons, but maybe responsibility to protect and other good norms that deserve to be defended. People argue that if Assad is seen as getting away unpunished with chemical weapons use, that Iran will conclude that the U.S. doesn't mean what it's saying in the threats that it makes to Iran, and that they will be more likely to develop nuclear weapons, that the chemical weapons norm will be severely tarnished, and that other powers will be more likely to use chemical weapons, and that Obama will be punished in domestic politics because he drew the red line and then backed away from that threat. So I don't want to say that none of these arguments make any sense, but I do want to present some arguments that, however much credit you give to them, when you leave the room today, I'd like you to give them a little less credit than you do at the moment. So I'm not going to say much of anything about moral theories, being in a room where there are already moral philosophers, but consequentialism is a principle in moral theory, that ought implies can, and that includes ought implies that you can make things better for the people concerned. But the parallel to that in just positive theory is situationalism in reputation making. So whether we're talking about psychologists in the laboratory or international relations scholars who study diplomacy, people who do research find that reputational inferences are not just one big undifferentiated, oh he's weak or oh he's strong, but those kinds of inferences take into account the situation in which the actor is making choices and deciding on a course of action. So if Obama, the United States, the international community chooses not to use military force in Syria despite violations of international law or morality, it's likely that people will draw the conclusion that it's not that no one cared about the chemical weapons norm. It's more likely that they'll draw the conclusion that there was nothing constructive that could be done at the moment with military force, and that the reputational consequences of that are mitigating. Same thing is true when we think about political leaders in a democracy that make threats. There's a huge literature in political science that argues that democratic leaders who make threats have an advantage in making them credible, because people that are the targets of the threat will realize that democratic leaders will be severely punished by their own public if they don't carry out those threats. Well, that's really not true. Democratic leaders that make threats and then kind of walk back from those threats generally are not punished. And one of the major reasons for that is that the public makes situational inferences too. The public gets upset if leaders don't carry out their threats, only if the public was hawkish in the first place. In fact, historically, the cases where democratic leaders make threats and then have buyer's regret are often things like Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he was pushed by very hawkish public opinion on the Cuba issue to make his threats in the first place, and that they punished the leader because they want to use force, not because there was some discrepancy between word and deed. Other political science research looks at the question of why actors worry so much about their reputation for standing firm in international confrontations. Jonathan Mercer has written an excellent article recently that argues that people worry much more about their reputation for standing firm than observers worry about their reputation. A case study that he did was on the U.S. concern to present a fearsome image towards the Chinese during the Korean War, to try to deter the Chinese from intervening in the war. But in fact, what happened was not that the Chinese didn't credit the U.S. with having firmness of resolve to use force, but in fact exactly the opposite, that the Chinese were so convinced that the U.S. had aggressive intentions that they decided to use force preemptively themselves before the U.S. could come and get them on their own territory. Ted Huff likewise has looked at inferences that the Soviets made after the U.S. defeat and withdrawal from the Vietnam War. Did the Soviets look at the U.S. as weak, turn tail, easy to push around? And Huff's book says that no, the amazing thing is how firmly the Soviets continued to believe that the U.S. was highly resolute, highly credible, was looking hard to recoup its geopolitical setbacks after the Vietnam War. Slight digression is the research findings in political science on the effectiveness of aerial attacks that are strictly to punish behavior, not to militarily win the war on the battlefield. Robert Pape's definitive book on this shows that punishment attacks, like those bombing escalation attacks in the Vietnam War, simply don't work. He looked at scores of cases. They don't work. What works with their power is to actually disarm the enemy with it and win the war. A final point is that the targets of threats are often very self-absorbed. They're not focusing so much on the threatener's reputation. They have their own agenda. They're concerned about the economy in Iran, the factional politics in Iran, as a result, they're looking at the credibility of the threat through a kind of perverse funhouse mirror in a way that's just very different than the reputation worrywarts are thinking about. Another point is that with the domino theory, the theory that if we don't stand firm in one case, then people will consider that we will back down in every case and the dominoes will topple. So who invented the domino theory? It was Eisenhower after the French lost North Vietnam at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And Eisenhower used the domino theory not to say we should do something really stupid and try to retake Dien Bien Phu in order to show that we can stand firm. No, he said a domino has fallen, therefore we need to make extra efforts to shore up the next domino so that the dominoes won't fall. So let me finish with that.
Thank you. Thank you hugely. Well, this is just a start, okay, but already applause. So what I'd like to do is collect some questions and focus them, and I think, in fact, I'm going to right off now turn this over to Chris, because I unfortunately have to go. And we were taping this, so we'll have a record of it as well. I'll say that for my own gratification. Thank you so much. It's exceptional. Chris.
Okay. I guess I would also like to thank everyone for taking part in the panel. This panel took shape with a number of fits and starts, and everyone was very patient, so I appreciate that. Actually, I think maybe we should start by asking if any of the panelists would like to respond to each other. I think that's probably pretty likely, given the mix that we have. Anyone immediately want to jump in?
Yeah, I think we should open it.
All right. Then let's start with the audience.
Hi, thank you for the remarks. I'm Dipali Mukhopadhyay. I'm a member of the faculty at CPA. I think my sense is there was a consensus on the panel that intervention for either a variety of normative reasons, or sort of more realpolitik reasons, maybe with the slight exception of Stuart, that it's not in our collective best interests or in the best interests of the Syrians to use force at this point. One norm or imperative that didn't come up was that of self-determination. And I wonder if any of the panelists believe that there is something perhaps different about this case because there was a revolutionary motivation which was fairly clearly articulated that kicked off this conflict, a popular movement to overthrow the regime. Does that matter at all? Is there any imperative to support that on the part of the international community? And is there, if not to support it, is there any imperative to not undermine it? And might, for example, the proposal of the Russians in which it seems the regime could actually be strengthened or perhaps preserved by turning over some amount of chemical weapons, which would, it seems, put out of business the revolutionary project. Does that factor in at all?
So just to repeat for the mic, sort of the heart of the question is there an imperative to support or at least not to weaken the norm of self-determination? Do we want to respond, or Jack?
No. It depends on what you mean by self-determination in this context. If you mean self-determination of peoples, I think it's irrelevant because the Syrian people are not a people, and so doesn't apply. If you mean democracy, like literally democratic process and outcome in Syria. Nobody expects that to happen, no matter what the course of the fighting is over the foreseeable future. So that doesn't really apply either.
What do you mean they're not a people?
The Syrian people have, I think, demonstrated a lack of agreement on who is the we that would exercise national self-determination. So, I mean, maybe there are people, I mean, I'm not the international law expert on the panel, but maybe there are people, if you think that, like, any collectivity of individuals that resides inside the boundaries of something that the international community has designated as a state or a people. But if you're taking it as a kind of social science proposition about nationalism and the likely effectiveness that people can coalesce and form a self-determining nation, the Syrians aren't it.
Yeah,
Well,
let me. Oh,
no, go
sorry.
ahead.
I want to add something to that. I agree with Jack, but I think the problem is maybe some of the presuppositions of the question. First of all, revolutionary. I don't know what that means for you. Shooting each other, civil war, all kinds of things are going on, and you don't. Revolution. I don't think is an apt description. I think right now an apt description of what's going on in Syria is a civil war. And of course, as Etienne Balibar said, there's already intervention from all sides. But I would affirm that, first of all, I did mention self-determination as one of the principles. But that was with respect to external imposition and the problem of what happened in Libya. Even if you intervene, then you're not supposed to impose. That's part of international law, too. But I agree that right now, it's not that the Syrian people isn't a people in the sense that the Syrian state had its addressees, namely the citizenry of Syria, but that in a civil war, that's also, it's contested who is the people. And by the way, no one, no instance, no group, in the sense of claiming to be the people, is the people. The people has to be understood as a pluralist agglomeration of many different groups, interests, factions, etc. And in that sense, the word to say that the revolution is by the people as opposed to X. Anybody can play that game, and that's partly, fans the flames of civil war. So I think that this is not the right lens with which to view what's going on in Syria now.
And I would add that indeed it should be, among our guiding principles that any solution that would allow the people of Syria to have a voice, that should be one of the goals. And if it is one of the goals, I think it's reasonable to say that any military solution, whether it be a victory of the regime or a victory of the various oppositions, will not lead to that.
Well, thank you very much for interesting comments, and I think I agree with my colleague here that there is a sense of consensus about the intervention, the type of intervention on the table. What I would like to hear more about, since we're all here, the alternatives. That is, like, we all also agree, probably there's larger consensus here, that the Syrian case is a very difficult case. But what is the best that can be done at this point by the international community? And especially, I'm going to throw in this moral principle here, especially again ethically, if we take first to no harm as the grounding, that is, like, not that you have to take that, but that would be my prism. And I would like to hear from actually possibly each one of you what would be the best.
So, in a nutshell, so what would be the alternatives to military intervention in particular, right? And keeping in mind particularly an imperative to do no harm. Right?
I was a graduate student here in the 90s when the Rwanda genocide went on. So we were all aware of everything, reading the newspapers every day, and then all of a sudden 800,000 people were dead. And for the next, going on 20 years, we're saying, how could the world have watched that happen and did nothing? And I'm not a big interventionist, so I'm not as much of an outlier on this panel. I critique the Libya intervention, so we have to remember that. The only point I was making was that a credible use of force doesn't necessarily have to just come from the UN Security Council. It's the only point that I was making. So are we gonna look back at? I've had 2 years of classes now with the Syria civil war going on, and every fall, and now we're on the second fall, but also my spring classes. Every semester, we're racking up another 10,000, another 12,000, another 15,000, and they say, and no one's really even aware of what's going on, but we're going to look back in 5 years and maybe there's going to be 500,000 dead, and we're going to have a lot of these very important philosophical discussions of why we have to uphold norms and protect this and establish that, and yet there are mass graves, and there are women getting gang raped, and there's chemical weapons being used. I don't have all the answers. All I know is that when we look back, the world is going to again ask, what did the world do when hundreds of thousands of people died right on Twitter and right on YouTube with the entire world watching? There are difficult answers to the question of what's the alternative, and we hear all different kinds of things. Some say just let them burn out. There are, Shiite revolutionaries against Sunni revolutionaries. There's some jihadis on the ground, and Iran versus Saudi Arabia are sort of the big players battling it out. And what's wrong with a protracted civil war where it's sort of a war of attrition? And the answer is the Syrian people are caught in the crossfire. I don't have all of the answers to the question of what are the alternatives, but we see the headlines every day. And I think that outside of the bounds of just the UN Security Council prism, we have to think of other outside-the-box ways of going about this.
Well, I don't know if we all have to answer this, but sometimes there are two bads or many bads and no good. That's just sometimes how it is. And I agree with what was said by my French colleague. If you cannot see an additional intervention having positive outcomes, but rather fanning the flames, then that's a serious problem. And in this case, I think that there are other kinds of sanctions. I think that there should be a great deal of writing and pressure exerted wherever it could be exerted to get the major players, the on the council and elsewhere, to bring people to a table. Because ultimately we know the only way that this is going to be solved is if that's done. And so, it's morally horrible, but I don't see a morally better alternative through military intervention right now. Now, of course, if this whole thing with Russia, if this is a game, and if for example chemical weapons are used again, or some other form of drastic mass killing occurs, then it might get us to the point where the international community comes together.
What if the UN Security Council blocks it again?
I said the international community comes together, and as I said in my presentation, it might get you to the point where there is a much broader group and broader consensus that now something else has to be done, and if one state vetoes it, and by the way, I'm glad to see that you actually I understand the problems with the veto structure in the UN, in the Security Council. I'm not ignorant of that problem. But in any case, if that occurs, then the constellation of the situation changes. But as of right now, this very moment, what would you do?
Can I respond to that just for half a second, or do you want to go down first?
I think that Jean-Marie was ready to go.
Well, and I think there are there are potential positive ways to go forward. I think if we had that discussion 18 months ago, some negotiation between Syrians, if it had the support of the international community of the P5, could have produced results. And I think the rhetoric of intervention and the sort of shadow position of especially Western countries didn't help. because they aligned themselves with the regional divide without seeing that there were better ways. I think today a negotiation between Syrians is not a realistic prospect. And so I think today there's much greater responsibility of the Security Council. It's possible, and there's no alternative to a much more decisive role of the Security Council in shaping the solution. I think it's not impossible that, considering the alternatives, both the United States and Russia see that a protracted conflict will not only lead to many more casualties, much more than what we have had so far, but also will spill over throughout the region and will become completely uncontrollable and be really catastrophic. And that the agreement that the framework agreement that they have reached on chemical weapons may be the basis for broader agreements between them on what a process should be, which would probably entail at some point elections. There's an electoral calendar of Syria that provides for a presidential election in 2014 and legislative election in 2016. Now, of course, it's hard to imagine in the present circumstances how that would take place. The sequence is something that pleases the Syrian government because they believe they would win the presidential election while they would have a harder time with the legislative election. So there's room there for discussion, adjustments. But when you think of how the Cambodian situation was resolved, with Khmer Rouge were they were not an easy group, and nevertheless, this eventually laid the foundation for something that is far from perfect, but that certainly ended most horrible period in the history of Cambodia. So I think the possibility of the Security Council coming together is not a complete pie in the sky. I think it's a real possibility. I think if that doesn't happen, probably the alternative scenario of further fragmentation of Syria leading to fragmentation of the region and a redrawing of the map of the Middle East is the most likely, and it's catastrophic, and I don't think we can do much about it.
Jack.
So I think it's important to take a really long view of this sort of problem. Sometimes there are problems that don't have a short-run solution, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in general the world is going to hell in a handbasket and that that the powers don't have a strategy to make things better. So there's a big literature in political science right now about the obsolescence of war, and I don't mean international war. I mean civil war as well. And you look at the numbers. The numbers of wars are going down. The numbers of civilian casualties from civil wars are going down. There's kind of a debate about what this means, why it's happening, whether it's just a blip. But something seems to be going on, and it's probably has something to do with the diffusion of democracy, the strengthening and maintenance of the international trading system, improvements in how peacekeeping is done. And so that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be some Syrias that just can't be fixed, but it means that on average, somebody seems to be doing something right.
So far, sorry, I'm Turku Rashiksel. I teach in the political science department. So far, the sentiment seems to be that there are overwhelming prudential reasons for not going ahead with a punitive strike, or however you conceive of the strike. And I wanted to possibly add one more to those, which is I wonder how seriously to take Assad's threat that if there is a U.S.-led strike on Syria, that he would retaliate by targeting the allies of the U.S., that is Israel and Turkey. And obviously that in turn raises the question of a NATO escalation, right? An aggression against a a NATO aggression against a NATO member drawing the broader alliance into war, and that brings forth, that would be an escalation. And I just wondered if any of the panelists would weigh in on how that might figure into this calculation. Likelihood of it.
Assad has made mistakes from his standpoint, but he's on the whole a rational actor who sometimes makes misjudgments, but does not engage in action that is obviously against his interest. I think, for instance, the use of chemical weapons, I'm sure that this was something that was decided at the highest level, but the impact probably was miscalculated, most likely. No way to tell. But and the fact that previous actions with chemical weapons had met with no response, so consolidated the idea that this was indeed something that would not have major consequences. That's a miscalculation. I think in the deliberate action to target a NATO country like the U.S. or to target Israel, when there was Turkey, or to target Israel, it's quite remarkable that when there was the humiliation of the Israeli strike in Syria, nothing happened, because the regime knows very well that Israel has overwhelming power and can crush him at any time. And so I think they're aware of that, and there would be other ways to retaliate rather than that. I think an argument that hasn't been mentioned against strikes is the broader context of Iran. And that at the moment when there is a slight hope of going through a diplomatic solution with Iran, which is the only possible solution, military strike in Syria would make that prospect, which is a fragile one, which may come to nothing, but which is a very important one and strategically enormously important. That would be seriously damaged, if not made impossible. And that's a very strong argument against military strike, in my view.
And let's take a half a step back. This strike that was supposed to go after Assad was described by John Kerry as going to be a, quote, unbelievably small attack. So we shouldn't overstate the destructive power of this strike that was going to lash out to some kind of a self-destructive act of retaliation by Assad that would have brought down the entire Israeli Air Force upon Damascus. The alternative is more likely. Which is why I don't happen to subscribe that the threat of the use of force is what brought about the whole Lavrov agreement and all the rest. Assad would have benefited if these strikes took place, if they were unbelievably small. He survived and was celebrated for having survived an American-led strike against him. If it was a pinprick attack, he wasn't going to come out of that in any way, in my opinion, harmed. He was going to be, if anything, it was going to be good PR against the United States and the region for probably there's going to be some civilian deaths one way or another. This is going to be a PR catastrophe for the United States and probably a PR boon for Assad, which is, I think, part of the calculus, not because of the threat he was going to lash out, but because they saw if it was that limited, it was probably not going to have much benefit other than they followed through on the threat, Jack. I mean, they drew this red line, whether you're right about the political science or not. The discussions in the White House were, my credibility is on the line. And if I don't act or threaten to act, the Republicans and the media and everyone else is going to, in this democracy, are going to jump all over him on that point. So he was caught up in it. He tripped over his own red line. But I wouldn't make it seem like that red line was ever going to be anything. He didn't want to attack, clearly. And if they were going to attack, it was going to be very limited. He did not want to topple Assad. He does not want to get involved with the civil war in a deeper way. So it was going to always be limited.